Michael Reynolds had reviewed countless employee requests throughout his career. Most were mundane, schedule changes, payroll inquiries, or time-off requests. But one evening, as he sat alone in his office long after everyone else had left, a particular message caught his attention. It wasn't a complaint or a demand. It was a simple, almost humble question. Would it be possible to take home any leftover meals after my shift? The request came from Sophia Carter, a line cook who had been with the company for just over a year. She had a spotless record, no complaints, no absences, always punctual. Yet something about her message struck him as unusual. Employees typically didn't formally request leftovers. They'd just ask a manager or quietly take what they needed. Why had she felt the need to put it in writing? Michael wasn't one to dwell on personal matters. As CEO, his focus was on the company's operations, not the individual struggles of his employees. But this request lingered in his mind. He pulled up her profile. 24 years old, no spouse, no emergency contacts listed. It was unusual. He leaned back in his chair, considering the possibilities. Maybe she was frugal, trying to save money. But the tone of her message suggested something deeper. It wasn't about saving. It was about necessity. For the first time in years, Michael felt a tug of curiosity he couldn't ignore. Glancing at the clock, 10:47 p.m., he realized her shift ended at 11 p.m. Without a second thought, he grabbed his coat, shut down his laptop, and headed toward the back exit. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he knew he had to find out. The night air was cool as Michael stepped outside. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few late-night workers. Through the kitchen back door, he spotted Sophia. She was wiping down the counters, her dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail, strands sticking to her forehead from the heat of the grills. She moved with precision, like someone who had done this countless times before. A manager handed her a brown paper bag, which she tucked under her arm. That must have been the food she'd requested. Michael watched as she untied her apron, folded it neatly, and grabbed her worn backpack from a hook. Without hesitation, she stepped into the night, heading toward the bus stop down the street. Michael hesitated. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but standing there, watching one of his employees leave after a grueling double shift, he felt a strange disconnect. For years, he'd lived in a world of private cars, first-class flights, and executive lounges. The idea of taking the bus after working 16 hours on your feet was foreign to him. That thought alone propelled him forward. He climbed into his car, but didn't start the engine immediately. Instead, he waited. Sophia stood under a flickering streetlight, arms crossed, shifting her weight from foot to foot. The bus was late. When it finally arrived, she stepped on without looking up. Michael followed at a distance, his instincts urging him to see this through. The bus ride was longer than he anticipated. At each stop, he expected her to get off, but she remained seated. The further they went, the more the city's familiar skyline faded, replaced by rundown houses, chain-link fences, and empty lots. Michael checked the time. 12:22 a.m. After nearly an hour, Sophia finally signaled her stop. Michael parked at the far end of the street, keeping his distance. She walked with purpose, never slowing or looking around. The neighborhood wasn't dangerous, but it wasn't a place you'd want to be alone at night. Then she turned a corner and disappeared behind a row of parked cars. Michael exhaled sharply, gripping the steering wheel. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. He mulled forward slowly, careful not to draw attention. What he saw next left him stunned. It wasn't an apartment or a small house. It was a trailer. Sophia stepped up to the door, balancing the paper bag in one hand as she unlocked it. A dim light flickered on inside, casting shadows against the thin curtains. Michael sat in silence, his mind racing. The sight of one of his employees living in such conditions shook him to his core. He had no idea that this night would change everything, not just for Sophia, but for him as well. Michael sat in his car, a short distance from the trailer, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. His heartbeat was steady, but his mind raced. This wasn't what he had expected, not at all. Sophia had been working for his company for over a year. He didn't know her exact salary, but it wasn't minimum wage. She wasn't a part-time teenager. She was a full-time employee working double shifts. That should have been enough to afford at least a small apartment, shouldn't it? Yet here she was, stepping into a trailer that looked like it was barely holding together. A place people lived in when they had no other options. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on the dimly lit interior. The single overhead light revealed a cramped, cluttered space. The walls were stained, the carpet thin and worn. There were no decorations, no signs of comfort, just the bare essentials for survival. Then, movement caught his eye. 3 small figures emerged from the shadows. Children. Sophia barely had time to set the paper bag down before they rushed to her, their arms wrapping around her waist. She laughed softly, her exhaustion momentarily replaced by warmth. Michael swallowed hard. These weren't her kids. They were too young for that. Siblings, maybe? Then an older woman appeared, frail and slow-moving, her hair streaked with gray. A grandmother. Sophia gently helped her into a chair, speaking softly, her hand resting briefly on the woman's shoulder before she turned back to the food. Michael watched as Sophia carefully unpacked the leftovers, dividing them onto 4 plates, not 5. The children ate quickly, as if they were used to meals being small and uncertain. The grandmother ate slowly, her hands unsteady as she lifted the fork to her lips. Sophia sat down, but didn't touch her plate. Michael's jaw clenched as he realized what was happening. She wasn't eating. She was pretending, cutting the food into smaller pieces, moving it around with her fork, smiling and nodding when the kids spoke, but never once taking a bite. She was giving up her own meal to make sure they had enough. His chest tightened. He had come here expecting... what? He wasn't sure. Maybe just to confirm that she needed the food, or to satisfy some vague curiosity. But this was sacrifice, and it made his stomach twist in a way he wasn't prepared for. He thought about his own dinner that night, a perfectly plated steak at a high-end restaurant, a bill that cost more than Sophia probably made in 2 days. He hadn't even finished it, and yet here she was, sitting in a trailer after working a 16-hour shift, pretending to eat so her family wouldn't worry about her. Michael exhaled slowly, staring at the scene before him. This wasn't just an employee struggling to make ends meet. This was a broken system, and he was a part of it. But what he didn't know was that Sophia's story was even worse than it seemed. He sat in silence, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. The quiet hum of the street around him felt distant, almost muted against the weight of what he was witnessing. Sophia smiled as she listened to the kids talk between bites, her tired eyes soft with affection. She looked happy, or at least she was trying to be. But Michael could see the truth in the way she rubbed her temples when no one was looking, the way her shoulders sagged when she thought no one was paying attention. Then the oldest child, a boy, maybe 10 or 11, asked a question that made Michael's chest tighten even more. "Did you eat at work today?" Michael watched Sophia's reaction carefully. For a split second, just a fraction of a moment, her face changed. Not much, just the tiniest flicker of hesitation before she forced that same tired smile and lied. "Yeah, I had something earlier." The boy stared at her, unconvinced, but he didn't push. He just nodded slowly and went back to his food. Michael felt sick. She wasn't just skipping dinner tonight. This was a pattern. She had likely been doing this for weeks, maybe months. And yet, she still got up every morning, went to work, stayed late, and came home with just enough to keep her family going. The weight of it all settled heavily on Michael's shoulders. He had no idea how deep her struggles ran, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about food. It was about survival, resilience, and a quiet strength he had never fully understood until now. Sophia's life was a constant battle to ensure her family had enough to eat, even if it meant she went without. Michael sat in his car, his grip tightening on the steering wheel as he processed what he was seeing. This wasn't just unfair. It was a glaring failure, and the worst part was that he had been blind to it. Inside the trailer, Sophia stood up, collecting the empty plates. The children yawned, stretching as they headed to a cramped corner in the back. The grandmother moved slowly, settling into what appeared to be a recliner instead of a proper bed. Michael frowned. That couldn't be right. The trailer was tiny, no extra rooms, no space for privacy. He did the math. 4 people, 1 room. Then he noticed it. A thin mattress, barely more than a pad, tucked into a corner near the kitchen. A single blanket was folded neatly at the edge. Michael's chest tightened. That was Sophia's bed. Not a bedroom, not even a couch, just a mattress on the floor. After working grueling double shifts, standing for hours over a hot grill, and serving meals to strangers all day, this was where she slept. Michael had seen enough. His company prided itself on being employee-focused. He'd sat through countless meetings where executives discussed fair wages and employee satisfaction. Yet here was one of his most dedicated workers, struggling to survive, sacrificing everything for her family, while he worked in an office with luxury amenities that cost more than her entire living situation. He thought about the company's excess, lavish retreats, bonuses, and the food wasted daily in the kitchen, food that could have fed people like Sophia. Michael closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing. This wasn't just wrong, it was a systemic failure, and he was at the heart of it. For years, he'd told himself his employees were well cared for. He'd approved policies, reviewed reports, and signed off on budgets, but he'd never truly looked. Now that he had, he couldn't turn away. Michael didn't go home that night. He stayed in his car, staring at the trailer long after the lights went out. His mind raced. How many others were like Sophia? How many employees were silently suffering, putting on brave faces while their lives crumbled behind the scenes? He thought about the company's priorities, the executive salaries, the marketing budgets, the unnecessary expenses, and then he thought about Sophia's mattress on the floor. His hands clenched the steering wheel. This wasn't just her struggle, it was his failure. He had the power to change things, and he couldn't wait any longer. Michael grabbed his phone and scrolled through his contacts. He didn't hesitate before hitting call. After 2 rings, a groggy voice answered. "Sir, it's past midnight. Is everything okay?" It was his head of operations, the person in charge of employee programs. "No," Michael said, his voice firm. "Everything is not okay." There was a pause. "What do you mean?" Michael glanced at the trailer one last time before starting the car. "We need to fix this. All of it. First thing in the morning." He didn't wait for a reply. This wasn't up for debate. It was a decision, and Michael was ready to act. By the next morning, the office was buzzing with change. Policies were overhauled. Leftover food from the kitchen was no longer discarded. It was packaged and made available to employees in need. Wages were reviewed and adjusted to ensure no full-time worker would ever have to choose between rent and food. A new emergency fund was established to provide financial support for employees facing hardships. And Sophia? She arrived at work as usual, unaware of the storm Michael had set in motion. Her manager pulled her aside and handed her an envelope. Inside was a substantial raise, enough to move her family into a proper home, enough to ensure she could eat without guilt, enough to give her the stability she'd been fighting for. For the first time in years, she didn't have to pretend everything was fine. Michael had walked into the office that morning as a CEO. He left as a leader. How many people around us are struggling in silence? How often do we look the other way? If you have the power to make a difference, no matter how small, don't wait. Take action today.